A question I get asked all the time by students, and I've been asked this by listeners, is this: what books should people read to better understand the Roman Empire? So what I've done is I've compiled a list of 11 books, and these are not necessarily obvious books that you might find on the bookstore shelves or featured on the bestseller lists on Amazon. Instead, I've curated books by scholars, some general histories, but some very specialist works, which are nevertheless accessible, inexpensive, and which I happen to enjoy reading. So much of what I do as a Roman historian is pick through books to find evidence and arguments that I need for my research. I rarely get to enjoy a good book on Roman history. And these 11 books are books that I have read from cover to cover, and I really enjoyed them. So, what are the best books on Roman history? We'll talk about it on today's episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Questions and Answers, Episode 10. What are the best books on Roman history? Before we get to today's episode, I just want to say thank you for bearing with me during these 10 question and answer episodes. I know that many listeners are here for the narrative and they like the big story that the podcast is telling. And in the next episode, we are going to get back to that story. But I did make a promise on the very first episode that I would speak to listener questions. And it was certainly fun for me to divert from the story, to interact more directly with what people are interested in, because I'm not able to have a conversation with all the listeners. So thanks for letting me know what was on your mind, and you can continue to do this. You can email me at colin@paxromanapodcast.com. You could message me through Twitter if you wish to. I'm Prof. CPE there. You can also leave comments on these episodes or comments on my YouTube videos over on YouTube. And by the way, if you are enjoying this podcast and you haven't done so yet, please click any like buttons or rate the podcast or review the podcast, whatever it is that you can do to tell the platform that you're using to listen to this podcast that you enjoyed it. What that will do is tell the platform, whether it's Spotify or Apple Podcasts or YouTube or whatever, that you think other people should receive this content. It gives me a bit of a boost. At the moment, I don't make any money from any of this. And so interacting with the show in some capacity is really the best way that you can say thank you, and I really appreciate it. All right, on to today's episode. I've got 11 books that I want to talk to you about and that I want to recommend that you read. And even if I only spend a few minutes per book, this will make this podcast very long. So I'm just going to dive right in. These are books that are about a range of topics, some general histories of the Roman Empire that if you read from cover to cover would explain to you the kind of overarching historical narrative and would serve as great companions to this podcast. But there are some others that are quite specialist in some way. Biographies on key individuals, specialist treatments of the Roman economy or religion, or just books that are written in an innovative way. The last thing I'll say is that in some of these cases, I know these people. The club of Roman historians is pretty large, but it's not so large that we don't all interact and meet up at conferences and other events. And I just want to disclose that none of these authors know that I'm talking about their books on the podcast. I'm not being paid anything to talk about any of these books. These truly are just books that I like and that I think you would enjoy reading. So let's go ahead and get started. I want to begin with some biographies. I know that people find biographies quite straightforward to read, and the oldest book on the list is also the first book that I want to talk about. And this is the biography of Marcus Aurelius that was written by Antony Birley. I relied on this book to write my second book, Pax Romana, the Plague That Shook the Roman World, because what Antony Birley does in his biography of Marcus Aurelius is stick very closely to the ancient sources, while at the same time drawing on a rich historical context to fill in the gaps about what we don't know, especially about the early life of Marcus Aurelius. And as you know from this podcast, Marcus Aurelius would be Roman emperor from AD 161 to 180. He was remembered as a kind of philosopher emperor, a stoic, a man who witnessed the age of the Pax Romana winding down. And one of the reasons it is possible to write a biography of Marcus Aurelius is because we have his personal journal in the Meditations, and we also have a series of letters that Marcus either wrote or that were written to him. And between all of these sources, Antony Birley constructs a really vivid and a fair portrait of Marcus Aurelius as an emperor who strove to apply Stoic virtues of justice and wisdom, self-control in his life, but at the same time had to deal with the burden of increasing pressures in various aspects of the Roman Empire. Birley's biography is comprehensive. It looks at Marcus Aurelius's education, his accession to the imperial throne. He uses historical context to talk about the kinds of training and education that Marcus Aurelius would have received. And he sees Marcus's philosophical worldview, which he obtained as a young man, as ultimately influencing the way that he navigated the challenges of prolonged wars, the Antonine Plague, and various forms of internal political strife. Birley's treatment of Marcus is, if I could summarize in one word, humane. We really see Marcus Aurelius the person, not as, on the one hand, a kind of stoic saint, nor do we see him cynically as a kind of fraud or a pretender. The book uses endnotes, which is nice for the casual reader. It preserves a kind of flow in the book. Endnotes, by the way, are super frustrating for a reader like me, who tends to read scholarly books in bits and pieces, scouring for bits of evidence or argument. I like to have the footnotes right there. But for you, as a more casual reader, you'll really like the way that Birley's book is laid out. This is a biography that is decades old and yet still stands the test of time. There have been more recent biographies of Marcus that have been great, but I still think that this one by Antony Birley is the best. Book number 2, also a biography, but completely different than Antony Birley's biography of Marcus Aurelius. This is a book fairly recently published called Perpetua's Journey, and it's by Jennifer Rhea and Liz Clarke, and it is a kind of graphic history. That is, it is illustrated. Part of the book is a kind of graphic novelization of Perpetua's journal, and the illustrations are beautiful and they are accurate to Perpetua's own writings about her martyrdom. Perpetua, again, we talked about her in the podcast, was a Christian martyr in the early 3rd century in North Africa, and she's especially noteworthy because we do have this crucial source. We have her own journal that she wrote while she was awaiting execution in the arena for being a Christian. So Rhea and Clarke take this primary source and they generate a really compelling graphic novel out of it. And then supplementary to that novel is the journal itself. So you could actually read the whole journal in this book. Plus, there are sections on various aspects of historical context, like what North Africa was like, what Christianity was going through in North Africa at this time. They think about big issues like Roman social norms, roles for men and women, conflicts over religion at the time. So it's more than just the story of Perpetua. It is really a kind of snapshot of her world. And it is really effective as a kind of immersive experience without necessarily being a video or a documentary. So that's Perpetua's Journey by Jennifer Rhea and Liz Clarke. All right, the third book, which is Rome, an Empire Story by Greg Woolf, is a book that I tend to just recommend as the first book that somebody read about the history of Rome. Greg Woolf's book is a kind of sweeping but accessible history of the entire Roman Empire. It starts when Rome was a minor city-state, hundreds of years before the Roman Empire, and then traces its journey to becoming a hegemonic power, and then ultimately the vast empire that it became, which we focus on in this podcast. I've had the pleasure of hanging out with Greg Woolf many times, and he is just a very generous, thoughtful person. I kind of think of him as a jack of all trades when it comes to Roman history. He knows a lot about all aspects of Roman history, which is why he tends to be asked to serve in leadership positions in the field, whether it's as an editor of the most important journals in the field or in leadership roles in various societies having to do with Roman history. Greg Woolf's book will also focus on different subsections of Roman history. So it will look at, say, the Roman economy, religion, administration, law. And the other thing I like about his book is that at the end of each chapter is a list of recommended reading if you want to read further on a particular topic or period. And Greg Woolf knows his bibliography well. And so his recommendations for further reading are very good. So it's an approachable book, but it is also a rigorous book and at the same time a sweeping book. Those are hard things to tie together in a single book. And Greg Woolf's Rome and Empire story really does that. All right, the fourth book I want to talk about is The Fall of the Roman Empire by Peter Heather. If you are looking for a good book that explains Rome in its later period, and especially the role that conflict with foreign invaders and migrants played in the fall of Rome, then Peter Heather's book is a great book. There are obviously lots of reasons that Rome fell, and I'll give you my views as we get to this part of the podcast, which we're getting to eminently. Peter Heather actually convinced me that foreign invasion was more important than I thought. I would have been in the camp of internal decay was the main factor, that Rome essentially destroyed itself. And that certainly can still be true, even if one also recognizes that external pressures, particularly through invasions, were also a major factor. And Peter Heather details very nicely the waves of foreigners. He talks about the Germanic tribes, he talks about Attila the Hun, and he talks about the sack of Rome in 410 AD. It's a very readable book. I just like the way that Peter Heather writes. And it is, in my opinion, the best book to come out in recent years to accurately capture both the details of particular invasions and battles, while also painting a really nice, coherent narrative which explores broader arguments about the significance of these invasions. All right, the next book I want to talk about is a very unique book. It's one that I would have never run into if my PhD supervisor would not have recommended it to me. The book is called A World Full of Gods by Keith Hopkins. Keith Hopkins was my supervisor's supervisor at Cambridge. And I never got a chance to meet Keith Hopkins before he died. He sounds like he was an intriguing person, but you get a sense of the man's creativity in the way that he writes A World Full of Gods. The book is ostensibly about religion in the Roman Empire in the first 3 centuries AD. It focuses on the competition between traditional Roman religions, Christianity, and Judaism. And he ultimately argues that Christianity was an adaptable and appealing religion in a marketplace of religious ideas. Okay, that's interesting in and of itself, but what really sets this book apart for me is the way that Hopkins writes. What he does is he uses these interesting narrative devices. So one chapter, for example, is about time travelers traveling back in time to Pompeii and walking around. And it's sort of their journal about what they see. And it's pretty graphic, by the way, so this is not a book for kids. But he's ultimately making a scholarly argument. He's writing about real artifacts, real frescoes, for example, that are seen in Pompeii. But by dressing up the scholarly treatment in this time travel narrative, or another chapter is in the form of a fictional TV drama. Some of it is just in letters. By the way, he writes letters back and forth with the famous Mary Beard in this book. I don't know if those letters are real or not, but it is a very clever way to do history. I have not seen another book that is as creative as this one. It's very experimental. It's also, by the way, pretty provocative, not only in the way that it writes, but ultimately what it argues. And I'd say that I certainly have some big disagreements with the way that he portrays Christianity, and in particular Jesus, who he sees as just sort of a guy that got caught up and co-opted into a newfangled religion in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. But even though I don't agree with some of the main views of the book, it's a great read. And so it makes this list. Another book on Christianity that I do largely agree with, and which I think is also an innovative book, is The Rise of Christianity by Rodney Stark. This book is now almost 30 years old, but I go back to it over and over again to understand the growth of Christianity in its first 3 to 4 centuries. Rodney Stark, by the way, is not an ancient historian. He's a sociologist. And this gives him a really unique perspective on why Christianity ultimately triumphed in the Roman Empire. He talks about Christianity's appeal to marginalized groups, especially women and the poor. He speaks about the organizational structure of Christianity and the ability of Christians to provide social support during crises, including disease events. No doubt you might guess, I also found Rodney Stark's book helpful when I was researching my book on the Antonine Plague. The most controversial aspect of Stark's book are his statistical estimates. So he tries to guess at the Christian population in the Roman Empire at various times. And he is just guessing, and he acknowledges this, but I find those estimates to be reasonable, at least as kind of thought exercises. The fact is, we really have no idea how large the church was at any given time, how successful it was at winning converts, and Stark tries to estimate some of these things using the evidence available to him, and I think he actually presents a pretty compelling case. But if you want to check out that book, The Rise of Christianity, you can give it a read and see what you think. The next book I want to talk about taps into my own interest in numismatics and ancient coins. And this book is From Caesar to Augustus by Claire Rowan. I happen to know Claire, and she is a teacher at heart. She is very good at explaining complex historical ideas and primary sources to audiences of all kinds, and this book really showcases that. So what she does in this book is she tells the story of the fall of the Roman Republic and the rise of Augustus, but she does it through coins. So almost every page has got at least one picture of an ancient coin on it. And you would think that this book would be very expensive, but it actually isn't. It's a paperback book. It's really inexpensive. You can get it on Amazon. And what Claire does is she just goes through coin after coin after coin, talking about how it tells us something about the narrative of Julius Caesar's Civil War, or the rise of Mark Antony and Octavian and Lepidus, the civil war between them, and ultimately the establishment of the Roman Principate. If I were to guess, I would say there are at least 200 coin images in this book. And by using the coins, Rowan really shows the importance of propaganda in this period. Obviously, wars mattered, politics mattered, relationships mattered, but just the barrage of ideology and advertising and marketing that we actually see through the images is absolutely stunning. And again, it just represents a kind of a unique way to tell the history of a period that has been talked about by a lot of scholars. But by drawing so heavily on the coins, I think Rowan opens up some new ideas about this period. And at the same time, she teaches readers a lot about how historians actually use evidence and objects in their historical narratives. So highly recommend Claire Rowan's From Caesar to Augustus. I want to stick with money for the next book. And this is a book that I don't necessarily agree with, but I think it's a really good book. And that is Peter Temen's The Roman Market Economy. So Peter Temen, if you don't know, is an economist. He has been around a long time. He was in Milton Friedman's famous documentary Free to Choose in the 1980s. And Peter Temen was largely interested in United States economic history. And he decided around the late 90s or early 2000s to take a look at the economy of the Roman Empire. And he was invited to give a talk at Oxford University, and he was laughed at by people in the room because of his ideas. And so he decided to develop his ideas more. He also began to integrate himself well with kind of the network of ancient historians to provide some insight in the areas where he did not have a lot of training or education. And this book, The Roman Market Economy, is the culmination of over 10 years worth of research on the Roman economy. And what he argues is that the Roman economy was a market economy. It was integrated. Prices moved largely according to supply and demand. He thinks the Pax Romana was a real time of economic growth and trade facilitation and improved living standards, even for ordinary inhabitants of the Roman world. And I'm somewhat skeptical of Peter Temen's conclusions, but one of the things that he does in this book is he uses a lot of economics. It is, in a sense, a book that also teaches historians about how they might potentially use economic theory. I presented a very different view, by the way, in my first book, which Peter Temen reviewed and he didn't really care for, but that's fine. I still think Peter Temen's book is an innovative approach to the Roman economy, even if I don't agree with everything that's in it. Economists aren't known for always being great writers. Peter Temen's prose is accessible and understandable. So it's a good book to potentially pick up if you want to learn more about the Roman economy. By contrast, let me also recommend The Roman Empire, Economy, Society, and Culture by Peter Garnsey and Richard Saller. This is a book that is now in its second edition. It's a little bit older, but it is by two ancient historians that staked a claim very different than Peter Temen about the Roman economy and society. Garnsey and Saller present a view of the Roman Empire that is far more pessimistic than Peter Temen. They certainly see the Roman Empire as stable and dominant, but at the same time, they really emphasize the role of things like status and culture in the basic functioning of the Roman Empire, and even in the way that Romans thought of themselves. One caveat about this book is it is probably the least accessible book on this list, diverges at times into some of the scholarly debates. It can be overly descriptive, but if you are up for a challenging read, I think this book is well worth it. And I'll say that Garnsey and Saller's view of the Roman Empire is probably the closest to my own, so I certainly found their arguments pretty compelling. And like Greg Woolf's book that I mentioned earlier, Garnsey and Saller also have a list of recommended reading at the end of each of their chapters, which is pretty good. All right, the last couple of books that I want to talk about. The first of these is The Roman Empire, Roots of Imperialism by Neville Morley. And full disclosure, Neville Morley was my PhD supervisor. I consider him a friend, and I think he's a great person in addition to being a great scholar. Morley's book analyzes the origins and the nature and the impact of Roman imperialism. He thinks a lot about the drivers of expansion. So ideology, economics, the military, and then he thinks about how expansion had various effects on the conquered regions of the Roman Empire. As far as I know, this is the first book to coin the term the military, agricultural, industrial complex as a way to describe the main force of Roman expansion in the Republic and early Empire. One of the things I like about this book is it draws on comparisons at times with other empires, thinking about how Roman imperialism is a kind of model, not always practical, but at least sort of in the abstract, for later empires, and Morley has a really thoughtful critique of that. Morley also does a really good job in this book of just explaining basic concepts of Roman imperialism. So it's from this book that I get the way that I describe imperium, for example, which is the right of a Roman commander to issue an order and expect automatic compliance. That is a variation of what Neville Morley says in this book. He's just really good at breaking down complicated concepts for a general audience. Having been taught by Neville Morley and seen him in the classroom, I can verify that he is also a very good teacher, in addition to a thoughtful and quite intelligent person. And while he's written many books, I think this book is maybe his best. All right, so we're finally at the last book. I realize this has been a longer episode, but I hope that you've gotten some good book recommendations. The last book I want to talk about is Hypatia, The Life and Legend of an Ancient Philosopher, and this is by Edward Watts. This is another book that served as a kind of model for me when I wrote my second book. Now, what does Hypatia, who was a philosopher in late 4th, early 5th century AD Alexandria, what on earth does her life have to do with the Antonine Plague in the 2nd century AD under Marcus Aurelius? Well, in terms of the content of this book, nothing. But what Edward Watts does in this book is masterful. He takes a figure, and that's Hypatia. We know a little bit about Hypatia, but we don't actually know a lot. And he blends every little bit of source material that we have with a really comprehensive understanding of her context. That is, what was life like in Alexandria at this time? What was life like in Egypt? What was happening in different philosophical schools at this time, what was happening in religion at this time. So he uses all of these contextual elements plus the sources to construct a really impressive biography of this woman. As a result, and what Watts discovers is that Hypatia was a focal point of political and religious tensions in the city, and I hope I'm not giving too much away here, she was also a kind of bulwark. The philosophy school that she created provided a kind of space for dialogue between people that would otherwise be at each other's throats, pagans and Christians. Through her, people of very different views were able to talk and dialogue and debate. One of the classes I teach at Indiana University is on ancient leaders and leadership, and Hypatia is the final leader I tend to talk about in that class, and it's Ed Watts' book that has really shaped my understanding of this woman and her work in Alexandria. I could recommend any of his books for that reason, but for me personally, the book on Hypatia has probably been the most useful, and it's the one that I keep going back to over and over and over again. So, folks have been asking me for a while, and now I can point them to this podcast episode for my recommendation of books to read on the Roman Empire. And with that, we are all done with this mini-series on questions and answers. After several months off, we are now going to get back into the narrative history of the Roman Empire. And just by way of reminder, we left off with the death of Aurelian in 275 AD, a man who was finally able to unite a fragmented empire. But as we'll see in the next episode, Aurelian's death marked a time of renewed division. The Roman Empire's problems were deep, systemic, and it would take more than just a charismatic and authoritative person to hold the thing together. But not long after Aurelian's death, a man rose up through the military, took control of the Roman Empire, and imposed a new form of rule to arrest the rampaging crises that were beginning to overwhelm the Roman Empire. Who was this man, and what did he do? We will talk about that on the next few episodes of the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocore. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.